Everybody, welcome back to the Friday seminar series at the Freeman Spogli Institute. Delighted to have you all back. We have a very special event today, although not as special as I wanted it to be, because we only have one of the two of our authors today. I just learned from Peter that Susan has fallen ill, and so she's not going to join us, but we are still delighted, Peter, to have you. Peter Baker and Susan Glasser are the author of a brand new book called The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James Baker III. Here it is. Please, everyone, buy this book. If you don't buy these books, they don't get written. It's just that simple, and we need these kinds of books to be written. So I'm going to say that at the end, but I'm also going to say it right now. I also want to confess, Peter, just so you know, I do a lot of book events here at FSI, and there's one of two categories. Usually, either I read the book and then have detailed comments about them, or I don't have time to read the book and I fake it with help, because I do more books events than I can. With your book, just so you know, and this is true, I'm writing my own book about US, China, and Russia relations over the last 200 years. I am creeping up to the end of the Cold War in my narrative. And so your book sits in a big pile of other brand new books, because there's been a lot of new research, by the way, because archives have opened up on the end of the Cold War. So I've thumbed through some of it, but I have not read the whole book. And as a result of that, just so participants know, I'm going to let you get in earlier than I normally would allow. I'm going to talk with Peter for about 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes of some questions I want to ask, but I want to encourage people already to begin sharing their questions with us in the Q&A function here on Zoom. So let's get into it. First of all, Peter is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, regular panelist on Washington Week on PBS. I think I'm obligated to say also an MSNBC contributor, as am I. He's the author of many books, including the bestseller, The Breach, about the impeachment of Bill Clinton. He and Susan together wrote a fantastic book called Kremlin Rising. I've used it in teaching, by the way, in years past. And now they have written, well, actually, Peter's written another book about Bush, but they've written this book together. Susan, who's not here with us today, but is a staff writer for The New Yorker, author of this fantastic letter on Trump's Washington, and as also, she works for an alternative news television organization, CNN, although I caught the both of you on MSNBC the other night chatting, what was that, 11th hour, I think it was, right?
We were up late. I guess it's not so late there, but yeah.
Yes, it comes on at 8 o'clock here. It's perfect time for when I'm working out, if you want to know. And I noted that she had special privilege to be on MSNBC, but just for one hit. Yes. All right, let's get to the book. First of all, I've written some books in my lifetime, and I think we just have to say congratulations to Susan and Peter. Writing books are hard. Finishing books are even harder. Lots of people, everybody at Stanford's writing a book. They're writing them for 15 years. It's harder to finish it. So congratulations first on that, Peter. Second, congratulations on hitting the New York Times bestseller list. I just saw that. And I wrote a book a couple of years ago that we were trying to hit that list when it first came out, and we just missed it, according to my agent. And it was really tragic, and you know, other people push you out. So I had to concoct a story. I was in Helsinki in 2018, and according to the Russians, I had to concoct this whole story about how Putin wanted to interrogate and arrest us. That was the event that got my book onto the bestseller list. You guys didn't have to do that. You did it on the merits of the book. So congratulations.
Well, I sure hope we don't have to do that to keep it on for a second week. That seems like a rather extreme way to sell a few books.
Well, but let's talk about some of it. First, let's start with the basic question. I mean, you and Susan write for a living. Peter, you probably write more words than any person definitely that I know, and maybe in the world, on a day-to-day basis. I read you virtually every day, including today, page 1 of the New York Times. Susan writes a lot. You'd think that people you know, in their free time, if they write for a living, might want to, I don't know, watch Netflix or go fishing or do Pilates. I don't know, go to museums. You guys live in a fantastic city. Why did you choose to research and write this book together?
Well, that's a great question. And first of all, thank you, Mike, for hosting us here. Thank you, Freeman Spogli. Thank you, Stanford. We wish we were doing it there in person. Believe me, one of the great things we were looking forward to about publishing this book was getting a chance to visit our favorite campus out there, Stanford, maybe even bringing our 15-year-old would-be eventually one-day applicant who loves to spend time out there too. But we can't obviously do that today, and this is the next best thing. So we're glad to be able to do it this way. I want to apologize for Susan. She is feeling ill. It's not COVID, but she will join us the next time. I think if we can find a way to do it. She would love to be doing this. And thirdly, before I answer your question, I just want to specifically say to Mike, thank you very much, Mike. And Mike was really, in a lot of ways, our tutor when Susan and I, more than 20 years ago, were first assigned to go to Moscow for the Washington Post. We were a young couple. We were just getting married. We worked together on domestic politics in the White House and this Monica Lewinsky scandal at the Washington Post. And they decided to send us to Moscow, which is kind of a little bit of a left turn for us professionally, but something we were really excited about. And Mike took it upon himself to really help us figure it out, to teach us, to tutor us, to introduce us to people, both here in Washington before we left, and then once we were in Moscow, when he frequently visited, or even by phone and email. We really owe so much to Mike for his wisdom and insight, intelligence, and help to decipher what's still one of the most interesting and compelling stories on the planet. So we go back a long ways, and I wanted just to say that.
Thanks.
On this book, we wanted we were talking about doing a biography, and we're trying to think of who is somebody who had not been the treatment of a big book so far. And we were stunned to actually figure out that nobody had written this book about Jim Baker. We were stunned because so many secretaries of state have biographies written about them who do a whole lot less, right? Who had so much less impact. And this guy was Secretary of State when the world changed, when the Cold War ended, when Germany was reunified, when Iraq was pushed out of Kuwait, when Madrid Peace Conference was organized. If that were all it was by itself, we'd say, well, that's a pretty good book anyway. Add on top of that this guy ran 5 presidential campaigns. He was Reagan's chief of staff. He was Treasury Secretary. Imagine like Karl Rove and Henry Kissinger rolled into one, right? Somebody who does both politics and statesmanship. And that's Jim Baker. So we thought, what a great life to examine. And then on top of that, we thought his story is a story of Washington, like how Washington really worked then and how it doesn't work today. I was in a cab in Cleveland. It's in 2013 when we decided the book. And we were talking with the cab driver about, dysfunction in Washington. And the driver in Cleveland, of all places, said, if only there were a Jim Baker around today. And I thought to myself, we were thinking about doing the book at that time. He volunteered it. And I thought, well, that's a sign. You got to do this book, because if the cab driver in Cleveland is wistful for a Jim Baker, it tells you that this is a life that ought to be examined. Interesting.
That's a great story. That's a fantastic story. I want to come back to that in a minute, but I want to ask you a few things, other things. You've done, it says 215 interviews for this book?
Something like that. That sounds about right, yeah.
Is that real? That's crazy.
Well, we did take 7 years, so it wasn't.
Okay, but just still, that is an incredible. 3 presidents, 2 vice presidents, 5 secretaries of state. That's an amazing amount of research. And for the scholars listening, we need to live up to the standards of our journalist colleagues. And I'm going to get back to that question in a minute. What was the most interesting interview you did? What was the most surprising one you did?
Well, as you say, we interviewed all these bold-faced names, all these historic figures, both Presidents Bush, President Bush 41 before he passed, Barbara Bush before she passed, President Jimmy Carter, who worked with Baker on a number of projects, and Vice President Cheney and all these others. Actually, the best interviews, though, were his family. In particular, his wife, Susan Baker, who is just fabulous and really, super smart and engaging and really fun to be with, and really the kind of the truth teller in the family, right? So when Baker may be spinning a little bit, as he did, of course, in his career,
right?
Susan Baker was there. She was there to kind of correct the record a little bit. We asked him in one of our interviews, for instance, we asked him, why didn't he run for president in 1996? And And he says, well, I'd been at the top of the game for 12 years and I was tired and I was exhausted. And she kind of cuts in, oh, honey, she says, the party had begun moving away from you. You were seen as too liberal. And it was great because she said exactly what was true, right? This is the Gingrich moment when the party was changing and it was no longer Jim Baker's party. So she kind of was great because she could cut through that and tell us things that he might not necessarily volunteer.
That's fantastic to have a source like that. Tell us about your own evolution of your thinking about him over the course, you said 7 years, right? So we all start out with premises and maybe biases, hypotheses when we begin projects, and then hopefully they change over time. We're not just out there finding evidence to support what we believed before. In your own thinking, what's changed? And related to that, maybe tell us one thing you think that is, one of the biggest misconceptions about Jim Baker.
That's a great question. Yeah, there are a couple of things I would say. One is when we started it was in the Obama era. It was 2013. I think you were in Moscow at the time.
Yes.
And we were thinking about Washington in what we already thought was a pretty dysfunctional moment.
Right.
The Trump era didn't begin until 2 or 3 years into our research, into our work on this book. And then I think that really crystallized even more how important this story was from our point of view, because, Washington has become, it wasn't just under Trump, but has become crystallized under Trump, a place that just doesn't work, right? We are 6 months into the COVID pandemic without a relief bill. Democrats have every reason in the world to pass one. Republicans have every reason in the world to pass one. The president has every reason to pass one, and yet they haven't. And I have to say that if Jim Baker were around, certainly Jim Baker, his era were around, they would have had a deal. Right? It might not be what everybody wanted. The Democrats would be disappointed, the Republicans would be disappointed, but there would be a deal. It would happen. And I think that what we really discovered was just how today's Washington is the inverse of what happened then. Not to romanticize the past, because it could be brutal. Politics was brutal and ugly then too.
Right.
Baker was a real knife fighter during election years, right? Ask Michael Dukakis or Al Gore. Neither one of them would tell you he was some sort of softie.
Yeah, exactly.
But when it was over, he wanted to govern, and he would sit down with Democrats in 1983 to completely overhaul the Social Security system, in 1986 to overhaul the tax code, in 1989 to cut a deal to make the Contra War go away. And that's what's different today. And so I thought that story became even more important as the book went on.
That's interesting. That's interesting. I was in Moscow in 2013, but I was working at the White House, as you'll remember, before then. And we negotiated the New START Treaty, the old START Treaty, you tell the story here. And we were having a hard time cutting a deal with the Senate. And we brought in all these former secretaries of state, including Secretary Baker. And I don't remember exactly the story, but I do remember him echoing something along the lines of what you said, like, this is a no-brainer. Like, why is this so complicated? Why did we all have to fly in here for this, meeting with the president to get this deal done? And we barely got it done, 71 votes, I believe. Not like the old era when these things could be done in a much more, seeing the national interest, not just a Republican or Democrat.
And I don't think any major treaty has been ratified by the Senate since then.
That's right.
I don't think it's even conceivable today to think that there would be one.
That's really sobering to think about.
That both parties would come together and say, yes, we agree with this treaty.
That is sobering. We're going to come back to Washington right at the end. But a few more historical questions. Tell us a little bit about, and I've looked at the book on this period. I've heard you speak about it before, but this guy goes from being a Texas lawyer and local guy, and all of a sudden he's, the man who ran Washington. And it's pretty late in his life, if I'm remembering right, Peter. He's in his 40s or something. How did that happen? That's a pretty interesting chapter. And could it happen again? But tell us how it happened with Jim Baker.
Right. Well, exactly right, Mike. And I think it's really relevant to you as a historian and political scientist, because we have this conversation all the time about history. Is history the story of great forces that are happening regardless of who happens to be in major positions of power at that time, or how much does the great man theory of history, determine where things go? And this is, I think, a story where you see how history could have been different. right? Jim Baker was not into politics. He was from a storied family in Houston that really built the modern city. His father, grandfather, great-grandfather were all Jim Bakers, and they built the institutions of Houston, including Rice University and the various artistic and cultural centers and the economics and the banks, but they didn't do politics. And it was against sort of the family ethos. But Jim Baker, around the time he turned 40, was getting kind of restless and was thinking about something else. And then a family tragedy happens. His wife becomes ill with cancer. And the one person he tells this terrible secret to is his tennis partner from the Houston Country Club, George H.W. Bush, his best friend.
Wow.
He doesn't tell his wife. This is an era when husbands thought they didn't have to tell their wives that they had a terminal cancer diagnosis. But he thought in fairness to him, he thought he was protecting her to make her last months as good as they could be. But He doesn't tell his wife. He doesn't tell his mother. He doesn't tell his kids. And we have in the book this letter that he writes to his friend George Bush telling him. That's a bond that is very, that's profound, right? Between two people. And again, Mike, you're a historian. I can't think of any other Secretary of State and President who had a personal bond like that from friendship that preceded politics.
Right.
It's that friendship that gets Baker really into politics. Bush is the last non-family member to see Mary Stuart Baker before she dies. And afterwards, he said to Baker, look, you got to deal with your grief by coming to work for me on my Senate campaign. And again, Baker was already beginning to think of it, but he dives into this, and this kind of saves him. This kind of saves him from this grief and this horrific tragedy. 4 boys left without a mother.
Right.
And he gets into politics. And boy, you could say that's when history changes.
And did he have a natural aptitude for it that he just didn't know? I mean, is that part of the story as well? Like, if you don't try something, you don't know. Did he have certain skill? I mean, I think we all agree he had incredible political skills. So, but you wouldn't have known that at that moment in history, right?
Well, I hate to say this to a university audience because, of course, what we tell everybody is you need to study for anything you're going to do in life and get a lot of good degrees and all that. But this is obviously a case where that wasn't the case. He didn't study politics. He didn't study history. He didn't study, he became Secretary of Treasury based on one economics class at Princeton that he did kind of on, right? And I think that it was a case study where actually instinct and natural ability obviously do transcend specific areas of responsibility. He becomes Chief of Staff, Treasury Secretary, Secretary of State, and he applies the same skill set to all 3 jobs. And it's a skill set that allows him to understand how the gears of power really work. So this book is actually kind of a study in power in a lot of ways. It's sort of like, in a way, the goal anyway, would be a Caro-like look at how power works in modern Washington, and Baker being the sort of preeminent practitioner of his era. He understood what the other person on the other side of the table needed. He figured out how to get it for them while getting what he needed. He's a conservative Republican, but he wouldn't stand on ideology or ceremony on any negotiation because it was too important to get stuff done. And he had Reagan's proxy to do that, and he had Bush's proxy to do that, whether it be Democrats in the Congress or the Soviets in Geneva. And I can't completely say what he did that was better than anybody else, but he brought such a natural skill set to it that it worked for him.
So I'm going to pivot back to the man versus the moment question in a second. I want to remind everyone that I'll shift to your questions in about 5 minutes time. So please ask your questions. I'll try to get to as many as I can. But one last piece on this diplomacy piece, because everybody, you guys talk about it in this book. It's what he's known for, a deal maker. And I would say, speaking as an academic, we don't teach negotiations that well. We most certainly don't teach diplomacy that well. If Jim Baker was writing a book, or 5 easy steps to be a successful negotiator or diplomat or otherwise, right? That's the amazing thing about this guy. What would be like on the top 2 or 3 things, lessons to be, Mr. Ambassador McFaul, you're going out to Moscow. Here's the 3 things you should do to be an effective ambassador. What would he say?
Well, I think the first thing is understand what the other guy needs and what his or her domestic politics are. What's driving them? Where are their red lines? And don't try to push them across red lines that they're not going to be able to cross anyway.
Right.
He did that even from the very beginning. As chief of staff, a great story is he comes into power. He's made Reagan's chief of staff, which says something, by the way, about both him and Reagan, because he had
Yes.
run not one but two campaigns against Reagan by that point.
Right.
Ford in
Right.
76 and Bush in 80. But Reagan recognized him as somebody who could help him achieve his agenda, and he didn't hold back just because they had been on the opposite sides of these fights. Well, the first thing he has to do is to arrange a power broking agreement with Ed Meese. Ed Meese had come with Reagan from California, true believer. I think Luke Cannon called him Reagan's geographer because he understood the mapping of Reagan's ideology and philosophy. But he was also thought to be an organizational disaster. Like they said his briefcase is where papers go to die. So Baker had to figure out how to assuage Meese, who really wanted the chief of staff job, without breaking the friendship or breaking with Reagan. So he sits down with Meese and they negotiate this 2-column power sharing agreement. And Baker recognizes that one thing that would help Meese is to give him a good title, counselor to the president, sounds good, and to give him cabinet rank. And Baker's like, I'll give you cabinet rank. What about that? And we interviewed Meese years later, and he still mentioned the cabinet rank as being a really important factor to him. Well, Baker understood that cabinet rank didn't mean anything. It was a honorific, right? It's just a great bragging point, but it gets you absolutely nothing in terms of actually work, power in a White House. And Mike, you've been there. You know what works. What most important, Baker saves for himself personnel, the press office, legislative affairs, and the staff secretary, which controls the paper to the Oval Office. So basically the things that really amount to power in a White House, he saves for himself, and he gives Meese something that makes Meese feel good, and that Meese wants, but doesn't actually take anything away from Baker. And I think that is lesson number one in any negotiation from his point of view, is how do you give something to the other guy that they walk away from the table? And you did that obviously in Moscow, but the problem is in Washington today, it's also zero sum, that if you give anything away, even if it's not something that is a priority for you, you're seen as a sellout.
Right. That's a great story. Really instructive. Well, let's turn to the man versus moment question. This is one I wrestle with in my own academic writing, right? You already invoked it. Is history made, or do people have a role? Do individuals matter? I think in academia, we tend to write out individuals because it's hard for us to trace causality, not to use too much jargon. You've written a whole book about an individual. But tell us a little bit about, I've gone on longer than I wanted to, so I'm going to ask 2 or 3 more questions and turn to our audience. But let's speed up to, like you just invoked. I mean, he was Secretary of State at one of the most monumental times of the 20th century, if not the most important, one of the most important moments of the 20th century. And help us understand, was it important that he was there, or could anybody have done that job? And I ask it because I was reading the Russia parts. I'm going to ask one Russia question. I'm warning you. That's coming next. And he's talking to Ambassador Matlock, and I used to be the ambassador in Moscow, and people always talk about Jack Matlock as being this fantastic ambassador, and he was so skilled, and he is, by the way. I know Ambassador Matlock, a fantastic diplomat, but he was ambassador to the Soviet Union when Gorbachev was the general secretary and the leader, somebody who really wanted to work with the United States, and then the end of the Soviet Union. I was ambassador with Putin. So, it's hard to be a genius ambassador, to manipulate history in the right way when on the other side of the table is Putin versus Gorbachev. And as I was reading that part of the book today, the collapse, which is this great story, you guys tell it really fantastically well. And I'm going to ask a specific policy question in a minute, but the man versus the moment, like, what if, Condi Rice had been Secretary of State back then? What if, Mr. Pompeo had been Secretary of State back then? Would the outcome of history been any different?
Yeah, I think if academics are biased toward the idea of great forces of history, journalists are biased, obviously, toward the great man of history or great woman of history, because obviously we're storytellers at heart. That's what journalists are. Right. So we do have a built-in bias. I'll concede that. But I actually think it's both. I don't think you can separate the two. Did Jim Baker or George Bush cause the wall to fall? No. Did they cause the Soviet Union to collapse? No. Did Americans cause the Soviet Union to collapse? Maybe we had a small role. You can argue about that, Reagan's buildup, all that stuff. But broadly speaking, that it was the Germans who brought down the wall. It was the Russians who brought down the Soviet Union. Now the question then becomes, all right, so what role then do Bush and Baker play? I think what they do is they take these forces of history and try to figure out how to harness them, right? Try to figure out how to direct them in a safe and peaceful landing, basically. And it didn't have to end that way. I think history sometimes feels inevitable. I don't think that period had to end the way it did. It could have ended in a much, much more dangerous, volatile, violent way. And so I think that's where you see the role of individuals. And I do think it mattered that Baker was there. Now, could have Condi Rice have done it? Yeah, very, very possibly. I mean, there are a lot of talented diplomats, Condi Rice, maybe a Richard Holbrooke. Think of some of the, the most storied figures in foreign policy of our recent years. It is possible. But Baker's particular skill set for that moment seems married to the opportunities that were there. And the German reunification is the one that comes to mind. The Germans wanted to reunify. Bush and Baker were actually behind the parade at that point. The Germans were moving much faster than the Americans had thought was going to happen. Condi does write about this in her book with Phil Zelikow. It's a great book.
Right.
But Baker and Bush then get ahead of the parade, and they recognize this is happening, and they decided to move forward in a pretty aggressive way. And Baker has to deal not just with the Soviets, who of course are very leery of this. He has to deal with Margaret Thatcher, who's very leery of this, and Francois Mitterrand is very leery. And by the way, not only do you have two different Germanys to negotiate with, you have two different German power centers in West Germany, in Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister, who's of a different party than Helmut Kohl, who's the chancellor. So I think it matters that Baker was there and tried to figure out this formula, because if they hadn't done it in the short time frame they had, who knows what would have happened, because it's only 10 months later that Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. And only a year or so later, really, till the coup, when Gorbachev is suddenly faced with a conservative backlash. Could Germany have been reunified at that stage? Maybe not. So I think yes, the larger forces of history are what really move, but it does matter that people are there to shape them.
That's a great answer. And the other thing you alluded to earlier, the people make history, but people avoid bad outcomes. And
Yes.
you write about that when he writes a memo to the president that, this could be the collapse of Yugoslavia, but with 30,000 nuclear weapons. That nightmarish outcome didn't happen. A lot of diplomacy is trying to make things not happen. And nobody writes books about non-events, right? I like to teach that when I teach about counterfactuals in my class. All right, I got so many more questions, but I see other questions here. But I want to sneak in 2 or 3 more. One is related to this. It's a question about the collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia. You capture that story great. It's very lively. You all got to go read the book to get the color. It's really well told. But I want to ask you the question of maybe what, academics have said this may be one of the greatest failures of Bush and Baker, which is that after the Soviet Union collapsed, they didn't step up. They didn't provide a Marshall Plan. You write about his speech at Princeton, right? That doesn't have the grandiosity of the moment. And then in the middle of it all, as you also write about, he suddenly pulled back to the other side of his job of politics, right? And Russians, including Andrei Kozyrev, who you write about here, say that the moment to consolidate democracy in Russia was the year 1992, and that's when Jim Baker and President Bush were not focused on that.
Yeah.
How do you come down on that? How do you grade that? How do you assess that? Conversely, I want to remind you what you just said. At the end of the day, most of this drama is about Russians and Germans, not Americans. But do you think there was some missed opportunities there?
Yeah, I think so. We asked Secretary Baker about that. In fact, we asked him actually at an event earlier today, ironically, and he acknowledged that in hindsight, they wish they had done more to step up. He would tell you that at that moment, there wasn't a lot of appetite to spend a lot of money, for instance, on a big Marshall Plan for Russia, because A, they were in a recession, and B, people, there's not a lot of history other than the Marshall Plan where nation states volunteer lots of money when they're not actually at risk, right? One reason why the Marshall Plan actually worked was because there was the fear of Soviet domination of Europe. There was something to fight against. With the Soviet Union collapsing, it felt to a lot of Americans like, hey, our risk is over. Why we need to spend anything on a collapsing state? And I think he would also tell you that it was a rat hole where money goes to, disappears, and who knows into whose pockets. And all those are reasonable things to say.
Right.
But having said that, looking back today with the clarity of hindsight through Vladimir Putin's lens, what could have been done to have stopped Vladimir Putin and the rise of somebody like him? And
Right.
I think that we let them go. I think people did what they could to try to anchor Russia in the West, but they didn't fully see the inevitability, or what the seeming inevitability of what would come back if they didn't do that. And I think
Right.
there was a sense that we won, and
Right.
it's working, and everything's okay. And you and I know better. You know better than I do. But having lived there, we saw how much the 90s discredited the idea of democracy and Westernism in Russia, and that's where we really lost Russia. Now, Baker also says he thinks that maybe it was not a great idea to expand NATO quite as much as they did. Maybe that was just too provocative, and we could get into that. But I do think that was a missed opportunity, and Baker has a part of that. And I think the country as a whole, in some ways, suffered from a lack of imagination.
Great answer. Really interesting. Okay, we're going to go to our audience. I'll save my last couple of questions for the end if we have time. We got some great questions here. One from somebody Phil Taubman is asked. He says, "Great, congratulations." And I should have brought my glasses. I can barely see this writing here. I apologize. Oh, this is a good question. I'm going to paraphrase it. Talk a bit about the way Baker balanced expediency and morality in the many roles he played, or failed to strike a balance. And to add to that, that was one of the other questions, this debate about realism versus liberalism, moral foreign policy versus not. Did Jim Baker believe anything? What did you learn about that kind of big debate that we've had in American history since the beginning of our republic, but most certainly about Secretary Baker?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you, Phil, for asking. I appreciate it. I hope you're doing well. Hello to Felicity. I think that Baker was an unsentimental person. There wasn't a lot of, bleeding heart in him. Just because somebody, around the world was suffering from some crisis, it did not move him to want to intervene. Now, remember, in that time, they didn't have sort of the CNN effect that we sort of have today, where things are brought home to the American public in a way that kind of, at least for a number of years, seemed to require us to get involved in parts of the world that we could safely ignore without much political blowback, right? In that era, if you didn't pay much attention to a Rwanda or a Somalia or what have you, politically you weren't going to pay much. You weren't going to encounter a lot of pressure back at home. But Yugoslavia, I think, is the classic example here, right?
Right.
They had spent all this time working on Eastern Europe and the Middle East. But when Yugoslavia collapses, Baker is famously quoted as saying, "We don't have a dog in that hunt. We don't have a dog in that fight." And, the thought was, it's up to Europe to do something. Let them do it. But we've seen time and time again that when Europe is left to take the lead, that it's often a fragmented and ineffectual kind of response. And I think that he gave one day to it. Basically, he stopped one day in the former Soviet in the collapsing Yugoslavia and met like in a round robin in a single building with all these different leaders, and came away saying, "Well, they're all a bunch of hotheads, and I can't really do much." And that was it. He didn't really try much harder. So I think that would be an example. Tiananmen Square, obviously, where Bush and Baker prioritized the relationship with China over any sense of, moral outrage. They did the bare minimum they needed to do in terms of sanctions and cutting off contacts just to keep Congress from making things worse from their point of view.
Right.
And there was a discussion about that. Margaret Tutwiler, who was Baker's right-hand person, was outraged by what she was seeing and kept pushing him. Why aren't you saying more? Why aren't you doing more about China? This is outrageous. And he would basically deflect her, saying, "This is not in our interest. It's not in our interest not to have a good relationship with China no matter what. So we have to do what we can to preserve it." That's cold-eyed. That is unsentimental. And it may or may not be right. But that was the way he looked at it. Right.
So we have some questions on policy, some questions on personality here. I'm going to kind of jump back and forth till we run out of time, okay? Yeah. And then there's a bunch of questions about Trump. We'll save those to the very end. Here's a really interesting question that only you can answer, you and Susan. Neil Pinnock asked, "One thing I'm curious about is how Baker and President Bush 41 maintained their personal relationship through all the years. How did it change when Bush became VP president? Baker was one of the last people to see Bush before he died." Tell us a little bit about that relationship.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. Look, it's often described as a sibling kind of relationship. And I think that's a good description. Both of them used that with us when we interviewed them. And it's important to remember that siblings fight, that
Right.
siblings get jealous of each other, that siblings get resentful of each other. They get on each other's nerves from time to time. And I think there was that in the relationship too. There were moments when Bush would just get really upset at the notion that Baker was perceived as the real power behind the throne. And
Right.
he would sort of snap at Baker, say, well, if you're so smart, how come you aren't president?
Yeah.
Right? And Baker knew, okay, that was a signal to shut up. At that
Right.
point, when Bush turned to that line, it was always, okay, time to shut
Time
up.
to move on. Yeah.
And Bush would occasionally rebel against this, like his pick of Dan Quayle as his running mate in 1988, he did without consulting Baker. And I think it was meant as sort of an act of rebellion. Well, I don't have to talk to him about everything I do, screw that. And Baker would tell you he thought that Quayle was a perfectly legitimate choice, but the rollout was disastrous because they weren't ready for it. They didn't know how to handle it. And from the beginning, that rollout was so bad that Quayle never recovered. And there was friction about the 1992 race. Baker did not want to give up the State Department to come back and run that campaign. And
you
Bush
had to take him on a fishing trip, right? You write about that.
Right.
And isolate him.
For months, they kind of had this awkward dance where Bush didn't want to ask, Baker didn't want to volunteer. Everybody knew it was inevitable because that was what Baker's role was, but nobody wanted to sort of push the button. By the time they did it, it was too late. And there was some friction, sourness in the family. Barbara Bush in particular, George W. Bush was sour toward Baker. They didn't think he did enough. Barbara Bush called him the invisible man because he was out of the picture. But, Baker sort of, they're family. In the end, they are family. And when the push comes to shove in 2000 and George W. Bush needs help in Florida, who does he turn to? Jim Baker.
Right.
And when George H.W. Bush is dying, as Neil alluded to, on the last day of his life, it's Jim Baker who goes to his house in Houston 3 times that day. And it's Jim Baker who's standing at his deathbed, rubbing George H.W. Bush's feet as the 41st president passes away. That's a real friendship.
That's incredible. There is a question about 2000 from Steve Ruddick. He asked, does Baker have any regrets of the role he played in the likely undermining of democracy with the halting of the Florida recount? I'm quoting Steve Ruddick directly there. Those are not my words.
Well, Steve, I don't think he would see it that way. I don't think he views it as the undermining of democracy, but I understand that a lot of people see it that way. Look, he would say that he is a ruthless knife fighter. When it comes to politics, he doesn't make any apologies for that. He doesn't make any apologies for the 1988 race against Dukakis. He doesn't make any apologies for 2000. He would tell you that he fought using all the legal tools at his disposal, and it was resolved by the Supreme Court, and that's the law of the land. Now, I will say a couple things on that. One, the media did our own recounts after it was over. People don't remember this because it took us a year to do it, and we published them after 9/11, and nobody cared at that point. But the New York Times and another media conglomerate did separate recounts of our own of the Florida votes. And both of those recounts done by the media organizations determined that Bush would have won had the recounts gone forward the way Al Gore had asked for them to go forward or the way the Florida courts had ordered them to go forward. The only scenario in which Gore might have won is if Gore had asked for a recount of all the Florida counties, which he never did. And had he done that, it's possible he would have won, but he didn't ask for that. And the Florida courts didn't order that. So that really wasn't on the table. So in some ways you can say the subversion of democracy, fair enough, I get it. There's a lot of things to complain about Florida, particularly like the butterfly ballot, all these other things where clearly votes that were meant for one candidate weren't recorded properly, but that wasn't Baker.
Right.
The last thing I'll say about this, and I'm babbling on, is that as bitter and as sour as Florida was, especially for Democrats, the difference between then and now is that in Baker and in Gore and in Bush, you had people who had fundamental respect for the system. And when it was over, when it was decided, Gore gave a very gracious speech. And he said, okay, it's now over. And George Bush gave a very gracious speech. He said, I'm now president of Democrats and Republicans. And they moved ahead as best they could. What we have now, unfortunately, I think we have a president who is already basically saying that this election will not be credible unless he wins, period.
Right.
And he's tearing at the fabric of the whole system in a way that neither Bush nor Gore nor Baker really did. And we could have Florida on steroids in a much more visceral and potentially dangerous way.
Right. So I'm bouncing around here. We'll get to Trump in a minute towards the end because there are several questions about him. But Daniel Gao, who I know, he's a student here at Stanford, he asks, what would be the most important lesson to take away from Secretary Baker's career for aspiring politicians and government officials? I wonder if Daniel's one of those. Any lessons for young
Well,
Stanford students?
Daniel, I hope you do get into politics and policy, because we need young, smart, talented, and creative thinkers today, because we're in such a different place. I think what Baker would tell you is, don't be afraid to make deals. What bothers him most about what's going on now is the inability or the unwillingness of both parties, but you can say which party is more to blame than the other, but both parties to some extent or another, don't see it as in their interest to make deals. The incentive structure has changed. In his time, again, not to romanticize the past, because there are plenty of bad things to say about the past, but in his time, there was a political incentive to making a bipartisan deal. If you were a member of Congress, you went to try to find somebody from the other side of the aisle to sign on to your bill, and then you get in a press conference and say, hey guys, we have this bipartisan bill. And you're rewarded for it by the political system. Today, you're punished if you do that. Today, if you make a bipartisan bill, you are seen by somebody else in your own party as insufficiently committed to the cause. You are seen as a sellout.
Right.
Compromise is a dirty word. What Baker would tell you, what his experience would tell you, is compromise is not a dirty word. It's how things get done.
Interesting. I'll come back to that at the end. Some fantastic questions here. I'll try to get through them all. This is a great question from Paul Meyer. What part of Baker's success as Secretary of State was the capacity and standing he possessed by the State Department and Foreign Service during his era? So in other words, his leadership, I garbled the question a bit, but his leadership within the State Department and its prestige, and has that changed over time?
It's a good question. A lot of the State Department didn't particularly like Baker at the time. A lot of them were quite wary of him. He came in there and he made clear, he said, this is a hostile takeover.
Right.
He said, I'm not the State Department's man at the White House. I'm the White House's man at the State Department.
Right.
Not every Secretary of State had that view. I think Colin Powell thought he was, to some extent, the State Department's representative at the White House to reflect their point of view to the president. Baker didn't look at it that way. He looked at, I'm the president's man here to tell you what the president wants. So there were some hard feelings there, and he didn't use some of the career Foreign Service officials as prominently as some of them would have liked. And if you go through the archives of the diplomatic oral histories, you'll see a lot of that kind of resentment on the part of diplomats from that time. But I think over the course of his 4 years, he won over at least some of them because they were the center of the action.
Right.
His relationship with Bush made the State Department the center of the action. And that's not always true. If you have a Secretary of State who doesn't have a good relationship with the president, it doesn't really matter then what the State Department thinks. So Baker may not have been their favorite in the sense of being, committed to the Foreign Service, but they did like the fact that what they were doing at State mattered.
Right. That's a great point. My sons, who you both know, they've been Lakers fans their whole life, and they had never been LeBron fans, but now they're big LeBron fans because he's on our team. A lot of questions here about Trump and relationships with Democrats. Let me try to kind of bundle them all together. And now I've lost the name, so forgive me if I don't call you out. But there's one nice question here about, say a little bit more about Baker's relationship with Democrats, right? And some of those go back to Lloyd Benson, the Bob Strauss. They go back to his times in Texas. Was it about those personal relationships that were first that allowed this deal making to happen? Or, and now I'm adding this because I'm, the incentives versus the ideological space, right? You can explain it in two different ways. How do you think he made it work? And then many people are asking, compare and contrast with the Trump era, you being, a chronicler of the current president. How does it seem different to you given the work you did here? And somebody asked very specifically, given that you have written so many of these kinds of books, Peter, do you do this as a way to help you in your day job, or is it the other way around? Your day job makes you interested in this, and then you go to write these kinds of books?
Well, these are all great questions. We try to take them as best I can. I think that to the last one first, I think that I think it was really helpful for me, and I think for Susan, to sort of spend time every day or every week in the past a little bit, kind of like a little time travel to a different era. because it puts today's era in context and tries to help us see what's different and what's not, where the things are in fact the same and where they're not, right? During impeachment, this impeachment trial a few months ago, which is hard to believe was actually this year, the issue, of course, on the table was the President of the United States asking a foreign country to help him with his domestic politics. Well, one night after covering the trial, I came home and I finished on deadline, and I was trying to get a little work done on the Baker book, and I was going through some files of his, and I found a memo that I had saved from the Princeton archives but never put in the book, where Baker has written down that Republican congressmen had come into the Oval Office that day and try to get Bush and Baker to get Russia to give them dirt on Bill Clinton because of his trip overseas as a young man.
Right.
And Bush and Baker say, no way, get out of the office. It's not something we're going to do. And Baker, of course, being very self-protective, he's a very smart, canny, bureaucratic player, puts this in writing. This is what they asked. We said, no way, don't do it. And boy, to see that memo at that exact moment, when I was covering today's events, I thought really put things in context, right? This was seen as over the line at the time. It's not that Baker was any, more ethical than anybody else. It was just, that was the standard of the time. You did that was crossing a line. Right. So I thought that was super helpful. And there was another part of your question I don't remember now.
Just the ideological spectrum. Is it that 30, 40 years ago, the Democrats and Republicans weren't as separated as they are, or was it they had those relationships, or, but I think you've already indirectly answered the question, the incentives have changed. How do you explain the lack of deal making in Washington today?
I would add that the parties are more homogenous than they used to be, right? There aren't conservative Democrats the way there once were that Reagan could work with across the aisle. Right. And there weren't liberal New England moderate. There aren't any liberal New England moderate Republicans anymore, especially if Susan Collins loses, which she probably might at the end of this cycle. And so because the parties are more homogenous, they just don't interact, ideologically, much less personally.
Right.
In terms of Washington, personally, they don't even spend much time here anymore. They used to live here all week. The kids would go to school here. Their families were based here, and they go back to the districts when they could. Now it's the opposite. They're here as little as possible, maybe 3 days a week, 2 nights a week. So they don't get to know each other. And if you don't know somebody, you're not as inclined to make a deal with them. And I think that social structure has changed in a way. And, I get it. People outside of Washington say, well, that's just the, entitled class being with itself. Okay, I get it. But if you really want Washington to work, these people ought to know each other a little bit, and they can cut through their disagreements in order to find ways of coming together.
That's a really interesting observation about travel and where you live and how you socialize. I remember when I was ambassador, Codells would come to town and they would say, I've spent more time with Republicans or Democrats on this trip than I have in the previous couple of years, right? Because just doesn't not set up that way. All right, I've been avoiding these Trump questions, but we're not going to let Peter Baker go without a few Trump questions, but it's related to Baker, the other Baker, not Peter. Julia Richards.
I'm going to plug in the computer. Go ahead, Matt.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
You can hear me, okay.
I can hear you, yeah.
Julia asks, how is it possible that James Baker can still want to vote for Trump with his constant erratic behavior so dangerous at home and abroad? To keep our allies and our allies something that was important to James Baker need to change in leadership. And I want to add to Julia's question, both, how does he explain his own position? But I'm not, if Jim Baker, no disrespect to the secretary, I don't think if he came out and endorsed the Vice President Biden, that's going to sway a lot of voters, right? It's not about that. It's more about what's part of the old norms that he thinks that he has to keep, that he is, if this is right, and you're going to tell us about what he plans to, maybe what he's already done in terms of voting. But also, Peter, say a little bit about, you've had this incredible years of experience talking to this gentleman from a different era in the Republican Party. Is there, in your view, and now this is more a question, Peter Baker, writing in the front page of the New York Times today, is there a chance for people like Jim Baker to ever run Washington again, or is this really now ancient history that you wrote about?
Yeah, it's a great question. To the first part of it, his Trump answer, Julie, we spent 5 years asking this question.
5 years.
5 years we've been asking this because we've experienced this with him. We already got to know him, and we knew him for a couple of years before Trump really came on the scene. So we watched him as he reacted to Trump's rise and take over the Republican Party. And he basically spent the last 5 years really wrestling with this, I thought. He was surprised that this sort of unserious character could suddenly be the nominee. He was for Jeb Bush, his friend's son. Trump is just not his cup of tea. And he has told us at various points he thinks Trump is crazy. He used that word. That's his word, not mine. He said he thought Trump was nuts. Again, his word, not mine. He hates what's happened on our international alliances. Baker is a free trader, not a protectionist.
Right.
There's so many things that he does not. And he's sort of the un-Trump, right? And there was Baker, whatever. He's a partisan. You could like him or dislike him, but he had a certain dignity, a seriousness, of purpose.
Oh yeah.
Right? A willingness. Yeah, a stability, a willingness to work with the other side, at least outside of an election campaign, and a fidelity to at least some version of the truth, right? That he's not, he believes strongly that you don't lie to reporters. It's a bad idea. I'm not saying that, anybody in Washington ever tells 100% of the truth, but he finds what Trump is a very offensive figure to him. And yet, as Julia says, he says he voted for him in 2016. He might vote for him again this year. At one point last year, we were having lunch with him. He says, well, I might be able to vote for Joe Biden. And then 2 months later, he says, don't say I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. I'm going to vote for my party because even though my party seems to have left me. And I came away thinking that in some ways, Baker is a parable for the modern Republican Party, or at least the Republican establishment, right? Don't like this guy. He's not their cup of tea. He is crude and voluble and violates every norm that they thought was important. And yet the party as a whole has accepted him, or at least accommodated him. And most of them are still going to vote for him. 80, 90% of the polls show, of Republicans in polls are going to vote for him.
Right.
And again, they may not love him. They may not venerate him. It's not Reagan to them, but they've come to accept him. So I thought his experience is important to know and understand the Republican Party that way. To your question, Mike, you had at the end was, you had a second thought. Is there a future Baker? Yeah, we think about that a lot too. I think if anybody could make today's Washington work for him, Baker might, because he is that talented. But it is a man and moment thing. I don't think that Baker would be as successful today, or a Baker would be as successful today, because again, the incentive structures have changed. The structure has changed. I think are there people like Baker? Like in the last few years, I would say a Leon Panetta, a Bob Gates. There are people like him who are sort of wiser, older figures who work across lines and are seen as pragmatic, but the system didn't really, offer them the opportunities that would make that possible.
Right. So we have 3 minutes. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 questions. Do you have time for 2 more questions here? Okay, sure. This is a question from Tom Finger, a colleague of ours out here who's spent time in the government. And he asked, did Baker have anything to say about the extent to which he saw his job as coping with developments that came at him as opposed to pursuing an agenda of his own or the president's? And then I have one more tiny question after that. So
quick answer to that, Tom. Hi, Tom. Good to talk to you again. Thank you for the question. It's a great question because I don't know what he would have done had the Cold War not been ending on his watch. He's not a visionary. Right? He doesn't have some great grand geopolitical theory of the case. He wouldn't talk to you about the Treaty of Westphalia. He's not Kissinger. In some ways, he did sort of take the world as it was. But then I think he did kind of impose an agenda on it. And the agenda was transforming this moment into a new world order, to use the phrase that they use, in which America would be the sole remaining superpower. You could argue how successful they were. You could argue how deep the vision really was. But I think he did impose a vision to some extent, even though that wouldn't be the way he would call it, I think.
Interesting. All right, last question. And I want to remind everybody, here's the book. This is 7 years of work.
It's short. It's a lot of footnotes.
I really do, seriously. Please buy the book, because if we don't buy these books, they're not going to get written in the future. When I showed the book, because when I showed the book to my wife, Donna, who Peter knows, her first reaction, Peter, was, they have a better marriage than we do. And so tell us a little bit about researching and writing a book over years with your wife, with your person that you tell us your secrets. How did you do it with over the years? How, what's the balance? Do you divide out the work? Do you do it? Just tell us how you did it with Susan.
This is great. I get the unrebutted answer.
Yeah, Susan's not here to reply. Yes.
Well, the good news is we're still speaking to each other, and we just celebrated our 20th anniversary, so I think it's working okay. We did one other book together, as Mike knows, called Kremlin Rising, about Putin's rise. That was harder. She was pregnant when we wrote that book. And in fact, basically, one night we were out to dinner and we were walking back to the house and she said, well, I think the baby has dropped. And me being a guy said, I have no idea what that means. But it basically means, I guess, the baby was coming soon. And I said, you can't do that because we've got 2 chapters still to finish. We went home that night and we stayed up all night and we finished and polished and rewrote those 2 chapters that were still unfinished. And she went upstairs. I walked upstairs a few minutes later. I said, okay, I've sent those last 2 chapters to the publisher. She says, good, I'm having contractions. So we had a baby and a boy, a baby and a book on the same day.
Wow.
So this book was a whole lot easier.
Easier then, okay.
And look, the last thing I would say, we started, our relationship was born in a newsroom. She was my editor at the Washington Post. So we established a pecking order early.
That's right. I remember that. Yes.
That helps. Who's the boss? Who's not? But it's our adventure together has always been both professional and personal. So for us, it's a great joy to have a chance to do it.
Well, great way to end, Peter. Give our best to Susan. Congratulations on the book. And before we close, I just want to say thank you to both of you for what you do for our country right now. I read everything you and Susan write. There's nobody better at trying to explain what's happening in Washington, what's happening in the White House today. And there's never been a more important time to do the job you're doing. And nobody does it better than you. So thanks for taking time out of your day. I know you got to get back to reporting, but congratulations on the book. And thanks for being here virtually with Stanford with us today.
Well, thank you, Mike. This is a great conversation, probably the most fun one we've had, except I wish Susan had been here. She's so sorry and she missed it. She would have loved to have been here. But thank you to Stanford and Freeman Spogli and the whole team out there and everybody who checked in today. A lot of fun. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye. Thank you. Have a great day. Yeah.